Migration is a growing global phenomenon that impacts individuals, families, and communities. Although migration is often thought of as an adult activity, migration by children and youth is quite common throughout the world and is on the rise. The United Nations estimates that approximately 16% of all international migrants are under the age of 20. Although this ranges considerably from a low of 11% in North America to just over 40% in Africa. One study comparing Argentina, Chile, and South Africa estimated that over 1/4 of all migrants are children under the age of 18. Children migrate for many of the same reasons that adults migrate. They move toward jobs or better education and away from poverty and conflict. In some cases, children are taken along as families migrate. Other children are in the lead of this migration, while still others follow subsequent to family members' migration. Traditionally, research on migration focused primarily on adults. When children were considered, it was as passive members of their guardians' journeys. Increasingly, scholars are recognizing the role of children in the migration process itself. This includes recognizing children's agency in the migration process rather than viewing them as incidentally impacted by the migration decisions of others. Children may be part of migration through several avenues. They may migrate with their parents. They may migrate alone. Children may be left behind when parents migrate or may live in an area impacted by the in-migration of others. The extent to which child migration is problematic may depend on the context and the age at migration. One important distinction may be made between young children's migration, up to age 15, and youth migration, 16 to 24 years. Youth migration is often motivated by expected changes associated with the entrance to adulthood. Adolescents and young adults, for example, may move to assume adult roles, such as spouse or breadwinner. Young children, on the other hand, are normatively viewed as dependents in need of care and are expected to remain under adult custody, supervision, and protection. The entry of young children into labor migration, for example, is inconsistent with international laws and policies enacted to prevent child labor. Another important distinction when considering the effects of migration on children is the type of migration under investigation: internal migration, moves within national borders, or international migration, moves across national borders. Both types of migration have been on the rise across the globe and may be motivated by similar factors. Internal migration is often typified by moves from rural to urban areas, particularly in the case of labor migration. Similarly, international migration is often typified by moves from less economically developed regions to areas of growth and ongoing development. However, migration across international borders is more likely to involve multiple legal and political entities. This may complicate the ease of movement between communities of origin and settlement and have implications for prolonged family separation or the opportunity for family reconstitution. Finally, the consequences of migration for children also depend on the forces that encourage such moves. The decision to migrate may be prompted by many factors, but an additional distinction may be made between voluntary and involuntary migration. Voluntary migration is undertaken for family formation, to find employment, to attend school, and for many other reasons. Voluntary international migration is often spurred by economic needs. Labor migrants leave their origin communities in search of better work opportunities. Children participate in this form of migration not only as the dependent family members of adult labor migrants, but as labor migrants themselves, particularly in the case of adolescents. Unaccompanied minors account for an increasingly large component of the migrant population. These children may be labor migrants or seeking reunification with family members who migrated ahead of them. Migration may also be motivated by conflict or natural disaster. Scholars typically define such movement as forced migration or involuntary migration. In this case, depending on the political circumstances, the migrants may be identified as political refugees. Note that involuntary migration may also include internally displaced people who do not cross national boundaries. Involuntary migration is more likely to involve multiple generations as entire families and communities are uprooted. But there is regional variation in this case. Many lone child refugees are located in parts of Asia and Africa. For example, more than half of the 15,500 unaccompanied children seeking asylum in 2010 came from Afghanistan and Somalia combined. Children may benefit from migration in several ways. For child migrants, moving away from conflict, scarcity of natural resources, or poverty can improve safety and living standards. And children are often active participants in the migration decision as they seek to gain access to education or employment, or to reunite with family members. Children also play an active role in the settlement process. They serve as language brokers for their immigrant households, translating and interpreting with service providers, teachers, and others in the receiving community. For many children, migration leads to greater opportunities and socioeconomic mobility than would have been possible if they had remained in the community of origin. Research on the well-being of children following voluntary migration, however, yields mixed results. Children moving from rural areas to more urban or developed areas are likely to see improved access to healthcare and education. Yet, even if they migrate with parents, children may experience housing instability, discrimination, lack of state recognition, and other barriers that limit access to education and full participation in the receiving community. Research focused on the educational success of immigrant children, for example, points to great variation across settlement countries, which makes it difficult to generalize the extent to which immigration improves or disadvantages children's educational outcomes. Overall, then, children become migrants for a variety of reasons, and the consequences of this migration also vary depending on the age and family circumstances of the child. The motivation for migrating, the resources available, and the geopolitical context in which the migration is occurring. There have been several international calls to recognize the rights and vulnerabilities of migrant children and youths, although many are still vulnerable to exploitation and danger on their journeys. However, children's migration may also bring greater opportunity, and the hope of a better life continues to propel children, youths, and their families to undertake their journeys.